Have you ever heard a question so simple, yet so profound it leaves the wisest minds speechless? Today we're diving into a story like that. A tale that has echoed through generations, about a child whose innocent query stumped the greatest sages of the land. Imagine a time of great philosophical debate. Scholars, mystics, and thinkers from all corners of the kingdom would gather in the grand hall of the royal court. They would discuss the nature of reality, the meaning of existence, and the secrets of the cosmos. These were men of immense knowledge, their beards long with wisdom, their minds sharpened by decades of study and contemplation. On one particular day, the debate was fiercer than ever. The topic was the first cause, the ultimate origin of everything. One sage, a renowned master of logic, argued for a prime mover, an uncaused cause that set the entire universe in motion. He spoke of infinite chains of causality and the logical necessity of a starting point. His arguments were intricate, woven with complex terminology and references to ancient texts. The hall was silent, captivated by his intellectual prowess. Another sage, a mystic who spent his years in silent meditation, offered a different view. He spoke of a boundless, formless consciousness from which all things arise and into which all things eventually dissolve. He described it not as a cause in the linear sense, but as the very fabric of being, an ocean of awareness from which the waves of creation emerge. His words were poetic, filled with metaphors of light and shadow, sound and silence. A third scholar, a man of science and observation, presented his own theory. He talked about the fundamental elements of nature, the atoms and energies that combine and recombine according to immutable laws. He argued that the universe didn't need a beginning, that it might be an eternal cycle of creation and destruction, governed by the principles of physics and chemistry. For hours they debated, each defending their position with passion and intellect. They quoted scriptures, they constructed logical proofs, and they appealed to personal experience. The king, who presided over the gathering, listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. Yet, despite the brilliance on display, no consensus could be reached. Each argument seemed plausible, yet each was also incomplete, leaving unanswered questions hanging in the air. The hall, once buzzing with intellectual energy, grew heavy with the weight of this ultimate, unanswerable mystery. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the marble floor, a sense of exhaustion fell over the assembly. The great minds had reached an impasse. It seemed the question of the universe's origin was a mountain too high for even them to climb. The king was about to dismiss the court when a small voice piped up from the back of the hall. "Excuse me, Your Majesty." All heads turned. Standing near the massive doors was a young child, no older than 7 or 8. It was the child of the royal groundskeeper, who had wandered in, drawn by the passionate voices and the grand spectacle. The child's eyes were wide with curiosity, taking in the assembly of robed scholars and the ornate decorations of the hall. The guards moved to usher the child out, but the king, intrigued by the interruption, raised a hand to stop them. "Let the child speak," the king commanded, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Perhaps some fresh perspective is what we need." The child, emboldened by the king's attention, stepped forward. He looked at the assembly of wise men, his expression one of genuine confusion. He wasn't trying to be clever or disrespectful. He had simply been listening to the day-long debate and had a question that had been forming in his mind. He pointed a small finger towards the first sage, the logician. "You said that everything must have a cause, right? And that there must be a first thing that started it all, with no cause of its own?" The sage, surprised to be addressed by a child, nodded slowly. "That is the essence of my argument, yes." The child then turned to the mystic. "And you said everything comes from a great big ocean of nothing and everything?" The mystic smiled gently. "A simple way to put it, but yes, that is my belief." Finally, the child looked at the scientist. "And you believe it all just is? That it goes on forever and ever?" The scientist, intrigued, replied, "In a manner of speaking, yes, a perpetual cycle." The child paused, gathering his thoughts. The entire hall leaned in, a collective breath held in anticipation. What could this child possibly have to say that these great minds had not already considered? The air was thick with silence, a stark contrast to the hours of debate that had preceded it. Then, the child asked his question. It wasn't directed at any one sage, but at all of them, at the king, at the entire court. It was a question born not of scholarly learning, but of pure, unadulterated curiosity. "Okay," the child began, his voice clear and steady. "But what was before all that?" Silence. A profound, deafening silence filled the grand hall. The logician opened his mouth, then closed it. His entire framework was built on the idea of a first cause. The concept of before the first cause was a paradox that his logic couldn't resolve. If the prime mover was the beginning, what was before the beginning? The question dismantled his entire structure. The mystic's serene smile faltered. He spoke of a timeless, eternal ocean of consciousness, but the child's question forced a temporal frame onto it. Before. The timeless? How could one speak of a time before time itself? The metaphor, so beautiful and evocative, shattered against the simple, linear logic of a child's mind. The scientist-scholar was equally dumbfounded. He had proposed an infinite cycle, but the child's question implied a starting point to that infinity. Before the eternal cycle began, it was a contradiction in terms. His scientific laws described what happens within the universe, but the child was asking about what was outside that system, before it even existed. The sages looked at one another. Their complex theories, their life's work, their intricate arguments, all had been brought to a standstill by three simple words. What was before? It was a question so fundamental, they had all built their philosophies to avoid it, to define it out of existence. They had created systems where the question itself was meaningless. But the child, unburdened by their sophisticated assumptions, simply asked it anyway. The king looked at the child, then at his assembly of wise men, who now stood humbled and silent. He saw it then. The sages had been trying to build a cage of words and concepts to contain the infinite. They were trying to map the unmappable. The child, in his innocence, simply pointed out that the cage had no bottom, that their maps had no starting point. He hadn't offered an answer. He had revealed that their answers were insufficient. The king began to laugh. Not a laugh of mockery, but a laugh of pure, unadulterated delight and revelation. The tension in the room broke, and soon, the sages themselves began to chuckle, a wave of humility washing over them. They had been so focused on finding the right answer that they had forgotten the power of the right question. The story teaches us something vital. It reminds us that true wisdom isn't always about having the answers. Sometimes, it's about having the courage to ask the questions that nobody else will. It's about recognizing the limits of our own understanding and embracing the vastness of the mystery. The child didn't need to know about causality or cosmology. All he needed was curiosity. In our own lives, we often get caught up in complex solutions and sophisticated frameworks. We build intellectual walls around ourselves, thinking we have it all figured out. But every now and then, it's worth stepping back and asking the simple childlike question, why? Or what if? Or, like the child in our story, what was before? Those are the questions that push boundaries. Those are the questions that lead to true breakthroughs, not just in science and philosophy, but in our own personal growth. The greatest sages weren't defeated by the child. They were liberated by him. He reminded them that the quest for knowledge is not a destination, but a journey, and the most important tool on that journey is a curious and open mind. Thank you so much for joining me on this little journey into wisdom and wonder. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales that make you think. And I'd love to know your thoughts. What's a simple question that has ever stopped you in your tracks? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious.